Hello everyone, welcome. We are delighted to have you with us at the Tetley for this live talk between Ro Hardaker and Matt Kennedy. Hardaker's work can be accessed for the next 2 weeks through Tetley's website and link in description below. So this feeling might manifest deals with how language may become embodied and how bodies may be transcribed into language. Working with other artists, networks, wrestlers, and members of the LGBTQIA+ community, Hardaker explores access as the opportunity to approach, enter, or an outburst of an emotion. Hardaker invites you to get lost in the work, encounter the layered happenings, flip between and rest on the works. They complicate each other, and it's okay for you not to understand or be sure. So Ro is currently one of the 4 artists we've been working with since 2019 on Tetley's Associate Artist Programme, probably one of the longest residency development programmes ever. And we soon look forward to a new cohort of artists too, to join us for this year-long mentoring programme. Ro Hardaker, she, they, works at the blur between discursive, visual and embodied practices. Their practice is emergent, necessarily interdisciplinary and undisciplined. By deconstructing and exhausting modes of performance, Hardaker redeploys both competitive and collaborative strategies to negotiate new processual terms, bodies and sites as they are being realised. Matt Kennedy, he, him, is a doctoral candidate in the area of trans studies, a poet and a boxer. He is the recipient of the Irish Research Council Employment-Based PhD Scholarship. His research areas and interests include trans studies, queer studies, autoethnography, popular culture, feminist theory, gender studies, archival studies, sport and masculinities. His writing can be found in the Irish University Review, Fruit Journal and a handful of zines. So I'm Georgia, Artist Development Curator at the Tetley, and I'll be managing the back end of this event. Please note also that the Tetley is a safe space for everyone, both in the building and online. This includes for non-binary, gender non-conforming and transgender people. So this live chat has been disabled so that harmful comments are not broadcast. We invite you to message the Tetley on Instagram, which is @the_Tetley, for any questions. So content notes for this talk may include violence directed at transgender people, state and police violence, and trans access issues. So thank you so much for joining us today, and I will hand you over to the brilliant Ro Hardaker and Matt Kennedy.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. Yeah, thank you so much, Georgia, for helping us with this stream, but also just the support you've been giving me, Kelly, Jack and Annie for the past 2 years. Yeah, and I also just wanted to take a quick moment to thank my collaborators on this project, one of whom is here with me tonight, but also Alicia Radich, Helen Davison and Nicholas T, who have all helped me with the works that I'm presenting. And then I also wanted to thank Hannah Wilk and Philip Bedwell, who are wrestlers, who I've been working a lot with over the past, year and a half, 2 years. Yeah. And I also just wanted to preface that me and Matt are very keen that this is just a chat. And it's actually the 3rd chat we've had. It's just this one we're doing here. And we hope that it will be, lead on to more chats, because we've been feeding off of each other quite a lot. And I think we've got quite a lot of interesting things to say. Yeah, having said that, I thought we could start literally just by talking about access and what access is. Are you good to start there?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So in the description for the work, I stole something which you said in a talk of yours that I went to, like a month or so ago, where you defined access as either an outburst of emotion or the means of entering into a space. Yeah, and I just thought that was a really succinct way of putting it. Should we start there?
Yeah, I think that's a good place to start, definitely. Before we do get into it, I want to take the opportunity to thank you as well for allowing me to, have these conversations with you. Like, they've been really, really generative, and I think a large part of why all of this is so beneficial is to kind of have two trans people in dialogue with one another, which I think is hopefully going to be really helpful for other people to kind of witness, specifically when we're talking about things that are really intimate, like bodies and violence and sport and access. And I think part of the reason why I kind of thought about like an outburst of emotion in relation to access was oftentimes I think access get housed within kind of diplomatic and democratic kind of ideas of trans people being allowed into something. And it was kind of about what is it, or what is the benefit of maybe linking action, anger, resistance, and force regarding trans people kind of making their way into different spaces. And what does that look like when we're not really interested in those kind of like policy pieces, or those kind of like, can we please participate, instead of being like, you have to do this thing now, or experience some sort of force, experience some sort of outburst.
I love that, and I think it's I love that kind of move away from like listing everything that oppresses us, and like that move towards like speaking to our capacities. So I think that's like, just that kind of allowing, not like letting us be allowed, because we can, but just like make that like generative move towards that. Seems enthusiastic. Great.
Summed it up. That's access.
Yeah. But also, like that, you were talking about like power and violence, and something I've really been wanting to ask you. I think we talked about it briefly the other day. Is taking a punch, and because like I'm so interested in touch, and touch as like a mode of learning, and like how touch can be affirming. And I'm just wondering, in like the ways that you experience like affirming touch through like a punch to the head, or like a blow, in this kind of somewhat controlled space of like a boxing ring.
I think that I've actually been thinking a lot about it as well when you were kind of bringing up ideas of haptic, and I'd love to hear you like talk a little bit more about that as well, like hapticality in your work and just in your life, I think, more generally. But I think in relation to like punches and stuff, there's such a difference between like, I suppose, how I had experienced violence in ways that was non-consensual, and then in a boxing gym. And there is, I suppose, in boxing, because it's like, it's always mediated by wraps and then a glove. So there's leather there, as opposed to like maybe in other instances where in bathrooms, men had hit me, and then in a gym where there's kind of this mediation between things that are like sexy, like rope and leather, and like they have different connotations in that sense, but no one in that space kind of wants to acknowledge that. And there is something liberating for me. And this is purely just over the past couple of days, I've been thinking about that there was something liberating for me, essentially reenacting a form of violence that was, really damaging to me at one point in time, taking that in another scenario, and kind of actually reclaiming agency over it, and feeling like even if I lost the fight or I was bad at it, I still had some semblance of control because I had made the choice to step into the ring or to engage in sparring. What do you think about it? Because wrestling is a little bit less mediated, I think, by other kind of
well, I think I mean, wrestling is such a wide sport. There's so many different forms of wrestling. I originally wanted to work with kind of more Olympic style sport, wrestling, because of the story I was telling you of Matt Beggs, Matt Beggs is a transmasculine American, was a college wrestler, who there was a big media fury, and there was a lot of policy being made to make sure he wouldn't be able to wrestle. It just seemed like really ridiculous, like over the top, like literally just let this kid wrestle, like rather than all these rules and regulations to stop him. So I originally wanted to do like that form of wrestling, and to think about the choreography of it and the style of it. But it just so happened that Hannah Wilk, who lives around the corner from me, is a wrestler, but the more kind of popular and easier to access like form of wrestling is kind of like American WWE, AEW kind of style, where it kind of mixes theatricality in wrestling. And yeah, I kind of just become so obsessed with accessing that and watching it and going to like basements of bars or like side rooms of bars to watch like big sweaty men running into each other, and noticing so many crossovers with like things I was thinking about already, about like reality and realness, stuff that we could talk a lot about in terms of like drag or queer identity. But one thing I really noticed, and it was at a time when I was going to say at a time when I was disillusioned with art, kind of disillusioned with art, but yeah, the audience is like so much a part of the wrestling match and making it real. Like the fantasy is built, it's co-created by everyone there, and I think to some extent that's kind of very similar in most sports, really, because you are kind of building a false. You're constructing a narrative, right? And you're pitting two opponents against each other, like you're just creating a binary opposition, right? Yeah, this is not anything to do with the question that you asked me, though, is it not? What were you wanting me to talk about? I just went off on wrestling, wasn't it?
I suppose I was interested about like the ways the touch then plays out, because there's actually when I was reflecting about it on the weekend when you were talking about kind of hapticality and touch, was like there's not a whole lot of instances about kind of like skin on skin that happen purposely in boxing. Like there's moments where like you kind of might throw yourself onto someone to kind of get a bit of energy back into yourself and you're kind of weighing down on top of them. But in terms of like swinging at them, like that kind of touch is mediated. Yeah.
So it's like a very kind of direct and like pinpoint kind of touch rather than a kind of a, that's really interesting. Well, I think because I think as well, I guess you're always touching a boxing glove, right, as well, aren't you? Not necessarily even touching skin. And I have an interesting fact about this, actually. So I went to viewed a talk by Karen Barad, who's talking about she's talking about like when we touch, we don't. And this is interesting to you, surely, because you're a scientist, right? But when we think we touch, we don't actually touch. Like the molecules of my hand never touch your hand. It's just the molecules between my hand and your hand that gives us the sensation that we're touching. Makes sense. So if I reach out to you, it's impossible to touch another human being. We touch the molecules between each other, which is just incredibly fascinating. But yeah, also, so you want me to talk about hapticality and touch, and it's interesting you're talking about like boxing glove and not actually touching, because like a lot of the ways I was thinking about touch when we were running the wrestling sessions, or when I've been working with Phil and that, is like touching the floor, like when your body hits the floor. Not only when we like it really close to each other and you can feel each other breathing, but like so much of wrestling is like slamming or like acting out, making a big noise, and like making everything larger than life. So that in itself is like really interesting, because I don't think, I think wrestlers probably do think about touch, but it's like collaborative elements of touch, like how can I get you from this position to that position in the safest, most efficient, like flashiest way. They're not necessarily thinking about like, yes, but how does this feel when we're doing it? And I think that was the bit that's been really of interest to me. So not available in this show because we performed it a long time ago now because of COVID. I did a live performance with Philip Bedwell at the Playhouse in Leeds, where we staged some violence basically, but we did it incredibly slowly. So he would like choke me out in front of an audience very slowly, or when I was working out a bit more, managed to pick him up very slowly. So it was about like really regarding how we move and how we get into all these positions. But hapticality itself, which is something you keep asking about, which I never talk about. I mean, there's a lot of kind of reading and stuff I've been doing around this, but one of the kind of quotes I really like about is Fred Moten and Stefano Harvey and the Undercommons talk about hapticality or love, and about hapticality being, it's not just like, so touch isn't just me feeling you, but it's, oh, I'm gonna have to just read this off a piece of paper. It'd be so much easier if I did that rather than pretending I'm smart. Oh, where is it? We're not going to get it, I'm afraid, Matt. No. Oh, yeah. Hapticality is not just the physical act of touching, but a way of feeling through others, a feel for feeling others feeling you. So it's like reciprocous. Like, and I think I was thinking a large bit about wrestling and violence that's like staged in these ways is collaboration. And collaboration doesn't just have to be like a conversation, or like collaboration isn't just us getting on. Like collaboration is potentially us having opposing points of view and finding somewhere within that that's mutual. So collaboration can be a conflict, and conflict isn't necessarily bad. Yeah.
I think that was definitely something that I took from the first conversation we had, because you had mentioned that idea of the way that you had kind of collaborated with others through kind of, you know, wrestling and combat sports and kind of instances of consensual violence. And I had always kind of thought about collaboration in boxing as something that happened like with me and my coach, or with people that I was kind of training with, but it was never I never thought of it in relation to the person that I was kind of fighting. Because there was definitely, and it could have just been the gym that I was in, but there was kind of a culture of the person you were fighting had to become someone else in order for you to fight them. Like, and there was lots of like destructive forms of masculinity taking place there, where people would kind of say like, that, you know, that man is my dad, or this man is taking on some other form so that I can jump into a ring and I can kind of take out all of this pent up violence on him. But there's probably something much more productive in thinking I'm having, you know, a collaborative experience with this person to kind of better ourselves in a sport.
That's last time we talked about like what you were just saying there about to work something out, right? Like I feel like a lot of sports, it's like if you look at I'm trying to think, like, oh, what other sports? Like there's that incredible violent like traditional game they play in that is it in Florence in Italy or something, where they have like all the traditional like houses of Florence, and the districts all have their own team, and then they have this like incredibly violent sport, and it's from like historically it's like the way they worked out like conflicts and stuff. And I think like the history of football, like and other sports are probably quite similar. It's the way of, like, we'll bring out our best man here, and that's like the way we'll make some kind of deciding fact, like choice over like I don't know, like who wins this argument, this conflict that we have as like two groups of separate people, right? So that in itself is interesting. But we were also talking, you were talking about like histories of like sport being introduced into like places that Britain had colonized as a way of like distracting and stopping resistance, like give people something to do so they don't realize that they're like the enemy isn't each other, the enemy is like the colonizer. And I think that sort of distraction, like maybe that happens in like, I mean, I guess I don't have much experience with this other than like being forced to play sport at school, and then like being older and like not being able to access sport or anything to do with like health and well-being stuff because of my identity as a trans person. Being like, well, I want to access this thing. The thought's gone, Matt. The thought's gone. Fill time. No, yeah, it's gone. You go. I'm sure.
Oh, I do think that point around kind of like the way that sport is historically introduced, and even it's interesting, like even in an Irish context now, like with COVID, even for example, some of the first things that come back will be sport. Yeah. Partly because it's leisurely, people need something that keeps them going, but also because it's really distractive, and it also boosts national morale, which is inherently linked to ideas of the nation, and is consolidated in the state. And I think I had equally a forced experience with sport when I was younger. There were some things like boxing was one of the things that I really wanted to do, like among other combat sports, and I wasn't allowed to do because I was assigned female at birth, and my family had very particular ideas about what kind of sports like children of a certain gender could play. And then as I got older, boxing kind of, I suppose, just kind of stood out as something that I had a real interest in pursuing. But also I had a lot of pent up rage, to be perfectly honest, that I wanted to take somewhere. And there was something quite liberating, I suppose, pre-transition as well, when I was very androgynous, like really did not pass. And I kind of was able to hold my ground in a space where people were consistently like, what are you? And kind of being like, it doesn't matter, I'm going to kick your ass. Like, I think is some aspect of access to sport is like, you don't only get to let the good trans people in, or the trans people that you think are attractive or pass. You have to take us all, or we'll all kick your ass. Like, which I would like to see more of in those conversations.
Yes, obviously, yeah. But I mean, there are so few trans people accessing sports, right? Like, when I've like been Googling around for like trying to find other people doing things, like I think I found another trans artist in the UK who's been doing stuff with wrestlers. I think it's great that there can be two of us. Like I just love that. But then like just looking at like I found like one trans personal coach in the UK. I'm sure there's a few more, but maybe they're just not public or well known. Like Googling for like groups and stuff, there's like very few groups putting stuff on. In America, there's like slightly more. But yeah, I mean, what is it with the like some of the policies that Alabama is trying to pass through at the moment to like stop trans women accessing trans girls accessing sport at school and stuff, and it's like there's literally like 10 people in the state who are accessing things at the moment. Like it just blows your mind. It blows my mind anyway. Maybe it doesn't blow anyone else.
It blows mine as well.
Yeah, it's just like, yeah, I mean, like obviously the well-being and the kind of camaraderie and this life skills that people could potentially learn from like physical education lessons, and you just be like, nah, but no, just because we're worried that transition equals performance enhancement, and it's like there's no evidence to back that up, by the way, no evidence. I have a quote here that could prove it, but I'm not going to do that. There was something in what you were saying about like this pent-up anger, which I'm sorry, it's just so masculine to me. Right? No, but yeah, obviously, like I think we can develop healthy ways, right, of being cathartic, right? Like, and not in the kind of like how we talked about this the other day, like how much can I take, like how much can I punch this thing until I feel better, or this other person, how much can I punch them until I feel better? And like yeah, I just something about like increasing capacity rather than just like get there straight away. Like yeah, I don't know, something about like moving slowly with these things kind of appeals to me.
I think like the only, I suppose, bordering on a holistic experience I have at that on like witnessing someone really trying to take the extent of that pent up anger out on someone was, there was, you know, a man who would rarely come to the gym. He kind of arrived in, and he was always kind of really warmly welcomed by the coaches, probably because he had kind of engaged in the sport as a young person. Like, and those people are kind of, they usually become the pro boxers. Like, there's a real kind of genealogy to the sport, and kind of family ties as well. But he kind of came in and he was sparring, and he really just went for this guy who had a whole lot of training, and it was nothing short of brutal until kind of my coach stepped in, and he kind of caught him, and he was like, whatever you're trying to work out here, this isn't the place for it. And it was kind of like, but what is the place for it? For, like, you know, like white working class men in Ireland who are like historically and continually opposed to therapy. And then, like, what is the place for it for, like, maybe like marginalized communities where, like, maybe therapy doesn't understand the nuance of their experience sometimes. So you're like Googling like a fool for a trans, like, specialized therapist who isn't going to basically be like, well, you're all of these things because you're trans, or you're all of these things because, you know, you're a black individual in a white society, trying not to reduce us to single identities. Yeah. But there was something, I suppose, quite liberating about seeing, like, my, like, coach Reg, who was just like real stocky, burly man, being like, this is a place for violence, and you've somehow managed to step beyond that. Like, there is a boundary around what people should be expected to take in that space, even when others are like, well, I'm going to try and push you beyond that boundary.
So maybe it's just a case of, like, making those boundaries a bit clearer. Yeah.
Because I don't know what it's like in wrestling, but, like, to begin a boxing match, you tap gloves and that's it. There's no, don't hit me here. Don't like, there's no conversation around, I have this injury, or I have to, you know, maybe do something tomorrow. Please don't give me a black eye. There's none of that. If you touch gloves, anyone's game.
Yeah. Again, because wrestling is so, there's more, well, I mean, I'm sure there's many boxing matches which are, you know, they know the outcome before it happens, but like wrestling, predominantly, they, you know, they know the outcome because it's they're telling a story as well, right? But I mean, when I've been wrestling with Phil and predominantly you kind of start a wrestling match in the same way, which is where you lock up. So you, like, square off against each other and then you lock up, and it's all about, like, test of strength and, like, who's going to win at this first point, and we can, like, just bend arms and stuff. It's just like showmanship and stuff. But then you just get, you know, completely opposite to that, because the storyline dictates that this person's going to, like, instantly knock this person out somehow, and then, you know, you have to come back next week, because it's all about, like, building up these storylines. I wanted to talk about, because you were talking about, like, not accessing therapy, or, like, not wanting to, I think there's something there about shame. And maybe I'd like to talk about shame, because I've been working with this, like, working theory, which I definitely got from somewhere else. I can't quite remember whose quote it is, but it's that this is a really blanket statement as well. It might not apply to everything, but I kind of like it just as a working method, that all violence is an attempt to replace shame with power. Yeah, and I don't know. I guess, like, being a trans person means living with, like, so much learnt shame. And yeah, I'm just thinking about how for you, if you felt that, and then how maybe boxing or violence or staging these, or even just training, maybe that's been a way to overcome that.
In part, yeah. I mean, I think you're right. Like, I think there's an author like Thomas Page McBee who's written about boxing from kind of like a trans man's perspective, and he does talk about kind of like his experience of violence, kind of abuse in different scenarios. He brought it right back, and he was like, there's shame somewhere at the core of all of that. And I think, like, you can kind of see how shame plays out even in smaller ways in sports, that, like, the second that someone's masculinity feels threatened, their immediate response is defense.
Yeah.
And then the next is violence. And there's someone is on the receiving end of that, in my experience anyway, whether that's in a boxing gym or it's outside of it. If a man is experiencing shame, someone largely like is probably going to bear the brunt of that. And I mean, sometimes it's himself, like not always, but sometimes it is himself. And I think sport was a way for me to, like boxing was a way for me to work through different aspects of shame. But there was definitely ways that it kind of made me feel more shame, or made me feel particularly more conscious of the ways that I was maybe performing my masculinity. And there were some times that I had to really check myself and be like, would I do this if I wasn't in a boxing gym surrounded by a load of men? And being like, I probably wouldn't. And then really feeling shameful about that, and having to kind of sit with what that means. Yeah.
Being shamed and like ratifying it with violence is something that you do see in wrestling quite a lot. Definitely from an essay from a book that I've been reading, but talks a lot about. I'm going to go deep into wrestling now. I'm sorry. There's this wrestling character called Goldust from years ago, played by Dustin Rhodes, who is from a wrestling dynasty. So again, in wrestling, you get a lot of these like families and dynasties. Son of Dusty Rhodes, who's like one of the most highly regarded WWE wrestlers from like their core audience, which is like white working class men, because of the way he was able to like talk about, always like tie back his like storylines and stuff to like how he was like fighting for the guys working in the auto shops or the car factories that were getting closed down at the time. So always like tying it to like this working class plight and making his enemies seem like a kind of like born with a silver spoon in the mouth, and how he's going to like defeat that. So there's that energy there, which is kind of like delightful. Also, like just like one of his pops and promos are just like fantastic. They are pieces of it. Like, they're so good. Yeah, you could talk about that for ages, and I probably will, but not now. But yeah, so his son, who is also a wrestler, and also his other son, who's like one of the people who runs AEW, which is like the new wrestling promotion. Anyway, we could talk about labor practices there. Yeah, but Goldust was this character, which was like, and he's like not your typical wrestler. He's very tall, and most wrestlers at the time, and kind of still are like more than, but like big, bulky, waxed chests, like long hair. And Goldust was like in a very tight lame gold suit, like a morph suit, but very tight, and like big and strong, but not a six pack, like a beer belly, like a bit pudgy. So has this more kind of like, especially like packed into this suit, this kind of slightly more androgynous look. And Goldust's character was all very kind of femme, and like gold wig, like makeup, like white face, big black eyes and big lips. And yeah, and in like the first match, like the announcers are like, oh, what is this creature? What is this, a bit androgynous, isn't it? Like we don't quite know what this thing is. But then they kind of play on that a bit, and then they're like, oh, but now he's being violent, so I like him. Like now he's like slapping the dude around the face, so we know what he is now. Like, yeah, and that's so interesting. Sorry, I went deep into wrestling. Nothing. Also, I feel like I like I've told you this before, and I've told multiple people, I've got no interest in being a wrestler. Like, zero interest. It's purely because people like I've got no way of accessing it, and I want to, like, just for fun. Like, it's a fun thing. Anyway, I'm also aware that one thing we did kind of talk about is the cultural production of men. I know we were going to try and not talk too much about it, which is kind of impossible when you're talking about these things, because there are so few people who are men boxing or wrestling, or if they are, they're not held to the same regard, or just even in sports in general, like people who are men, they're like less highly regarded. Like, so women's football, like the viewership ratings are like so much less. They get paid so much less. And I think that's true across everything. Yeah, but we did say we were going to like
trying to get into it.
Reduction of them.
Yeah. I had been thinking about something that I think I'd messaged about to you before, being like, I'll tell you this story about it. And I think after we've been talking so much about like masculinity and men, it was kind of a perfect example of how I suppose they understand. Well, in the boxing gym I was in anyway, which, you know, probably presents a really good picture anyway, was around how they understand what consolidates manhood or masculinity. And when I like went to the UK to get top surgery, I kind of was going to be out of training for 3 months, and I kind of confided in my coach and in real layman's terms what was kind of going to be happening. And somehow he kind of thought that I was going to the UK, I was getting the surgery. So there was, you know, Frankenstein's monster-esque. I was going to, you know, come back completely transformed. And obviously he had kind of communicated this, you know, not totally correctly, but not offensively in my book anyway, to other people who I was training with. And I came back, and there was kind of this understanding that I had come back with a penis somehow. And the way that they approached me, and the way it was like my masculinity was unquestionable then. After that, there was no sense that I wasn't a man, and it that real moment was just like, okay, this is what manhood is for these men. Like it is having a penis. And that was, I was kind of like, there's more to you. Come on, fellas. Like there's more to what's going on here. There's more to your masculinity. And I think that boxing in some sense made me enraged at the culture of manhood, but it also actually, and though I sometimes hate to admit it, it made me sympathetic to it, because they're, number one, they don't like, they're not given in society a space to critically analyze why they are the way they are and their relationship to their gender, among other things. But they also don't allow that of each other. There's a complete lockdown the second that someone's like, maybe we shouldn't do this thing, guys, this is a bit fucked. And you know, someone else is like, but we're not men if we don't kind of do this particular thing. So it's, and I'm like, how do you destabilize that then, if that's their, you know, that's their piece to the resistance, is like their bodies, and even more reductive still, and they kind of apply that logic everywhere. How do you even begin to kind of unravel that? Because it's sometimes, I think, what we can communicate at in a really nuanced way as trans people, like we have come to all of these big conversations around sex and gender that we can kind of outwardly communicate quite well to I know that me and you could chat here for ages and I'd know exactly your experience and we'd be able to understand sex and gender in a really different way. But it's kind of like, how do you communicate that to someone that it's almost as if gender is not a thing, like, because it's so stable, like, or they're told it's so stable for them, and a large part of their identity is predicated on that stability.
Yeah, so maybe this is where we come into the art bit. Yeah, I need to talk about two things to wrap this up.
Thank God you've got answers.
No, I just think there's some, like when I've been working with Phil in the performances, none of which are in this show, by the way, and moving really slowly and acting out and staging these. Some of it's wrestling, some of it's grappling, some of it's just choreography that we've snapped together where he's choking me out and whatnot. Something about the encounter of like trying to find a way of understanding each other without having to use words. Like yeah, us two trans people could talk for length about sex and gender and blah 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 blah. And we kind of understand each other, and we probably end up getting like overly academic about it, and like we just quote people, and it'd be really annoying, and no one else would understand it. We're not done the reading because it doesn't matter to them as much, or if it does matter to them as much, they've just not accessed that stuff, right? And I think that's the way we kind of are forced to find a way of understanding ourselves. But there's other ways of doing that, right? And I guess that's why I'm interested in sports, because sports. You told me earlier how much you appreciated my Cafe Alpha reference. But Cafe Alpha talking about like it being in a gym, and like the language of the gym is very direct. It's like, how many reps? 20. Or it's like grunts and groans. So that. And we did have a chat about sound the other day, didn't we, as well? Yeah, just why can't there should be other ways to talk about it as well, and some of those ways should be non-verbal. So that. The other thing is, like, I keep being like, oh, this thing we're talking about is not in the show. Like, going back to Hapticality, like, a lot of the work that's in the show has been made in direct response to the fact that we're not able to touch at the moment. Like, wrestling and sport and boxing is not able to happen at all at the moment, unless you're a Premiership footballer. Or unless you're like a YouTube star who can like book a boxing match for you and another YouTube star, or you know, there's so access to these things is like very like depending on your social and economic status at the moment. So yeah, a lot of the work's being made in that context is like, how do we touch when we can't touch? So like thinking about how just thinking around touch and thinking around like the same forms of collaboration that I'm looking for within touch that are just impossible to access, right? And then the histories and the politics of touch, like what that means to be a queer person touching. Like, I don't know, I'm so awkward about touch. Like, in fact, like when I was in France with Leanne, like when I first met Leanne, like gosh, like 2 or more years ago now, Nico, who was one of the artists there, asked us to do this activity where we sat down and we would just like very slowly like touch each other. So like I was doing it with Leanne. I think Leanne like touched my knee and I was like, don't touch me. This is too much. Yeah, and I think a lot of people are probably going to be feeling like that now after the pandemic, where we're like, how do we re-engage with touch? How do we like, because we've not touched people for so long. Like, we've touched less people for like an amount of time. So how do we like re-engage with that, and how do we make it like not scary? Because I think touch is very scary, because I think touch is inherently violent, and I don't necessarily think that violence is always a bad thing in that case. Obviously touch can be incredibly violent and disruptive and damaging, and there are forms of touch that can like affect us mentally for like a long time. Yeah, but I'm just touch and self-touch, and like I don't know what I'm trying to say, Mark, but it feels like there's not there, and I was hoping you would finish my sentence.
No, I think there definitely is something there, like 100%, and I really echo like all of the things that you've said around touch, particularly like now it's interesting to think about maybe what was inherent for trans people around feelings of touch and parts of you that were off limits, and that now that maybe translates in a different way to people who would have never maybe experienced that kind of visceral, embodied sense of uncomfort towards kind of being physical in their body when someone else is reaching out to them. And there was a real sense of, I suppose, when I was boxing, of coming to terms with men's touch, because that was something that I was like, no, like for loads of different reasons, for such a large part of my life, was men scared me. I envied them, their bodies, all that kind of stuff, that I couldn't, up until the point of transition, really engage with the idea of a man's body, like a cis man's body, being anywhere near mine, or let alone touching me, because I was like, this is going to become such a brutalistic comparison for me that it will obliterate me, like that I couldn't bear the idea of that. And then getting to a point where not only could I kind of physically hold that space and mirror them, that I could allow for their touch as well. And then kind of that, you know, becomes leaky and ends up in all other parts of our lives in terms of like just the way that we move through the world and our sexuality and different things like that. But I think thinking about touch in a lot of different ways, more so than just kind of like reaching out and it's this gentle idea, but that actually there's a lot more nuance to it.
I think we're getting we've got to 45 minutes almost, Matt, and we said that we would like open it up to questions, and I've seen that one has just been put in the chat. Okay. How does the non-verbal performative aspect of wrestling navigate shame? Have you seen examples of this? I can't think of any specific examples, and I'm sure you can't because you're not into wrestling. No, that's put me on the spot. I can think of like, I went to see some wrestling in Leeds with my flatmate Ali, because she's like a really big wrestling fan, and there was one guy who was wrestling who really wanted to like build a story, and his character wanted to say something, so he kept trying to say something, and the other guy would just go straight in for a slap. So he never got a chance to say anything, and it was something so kind of like, I felt like the shame of this dude like being in front of people and like saying stuff and like trying to like build a character and stuff, and this other guy like slapping him down every time. But yeah, I don't think I can think of any other like particular, like I'm sure I have hundreds, but like just being on the spot like that, I can't. How about in like in boxing, have you noticed like?
I think there's non-verbal, I suppose there's ways that, but it always kind of is predicated on other people. Like there's been times when like when you hit, I suppose, and it's different in a way maybe to wrestling, like when you hit the mat, that's it, like you've really messed up, like you're out. In boxing, especially amateur boxing, there kind of is no, like if you hit the mat, you're gone, like that's the match kind of over. Sometimes they'll let you kind of finish it out just for, you know, a bit of camaraderie, but you're kind of gone. There's been, I suppose, moments where like you know, when you're kind of down or even your face down, and you before you know it, you're kind of on your feet again. Either your opponent has pulled you back up because they're not done with you, or someone in your corner has found their way in and is kind of shoving you back in your feet. And I don't know if it dispels the shame in that instance, but it definitely feels like those people create some sort of a barrier around you, or they kind of are maybe it's a bit more of kind of like acknowledging that moment of shame and asking you to just move beyond it, because it is kind of, you know, you do want to really check out, because everyone is watching you and you've just gone down kind of like a ton of bricks.
I'm hyper aware that like at the end of a wrestling match, what usually happens is like, you know, you'll get the loser will like roll around on the floor for a bit, look despondent, and like slap the floor, and then like get up and walk off, and then the winner will be like going around the ring and like chanting and cheering. Yeah, so then how does a boxing match end? Like does like one person just end up knocked out and dragged off?
Well, in amateur boxing, it's kind of done at like scoring, so it's interesting in that like someone, you know, there's judges who are watching you, and like most, like some boxers are kind of like it's just about strength, but actually there's a lot of performance kind of in that, and where you punch them, like, and some of it has to be quite strategic in that like I'm quite short, so there's very few people who could match me height wise, so I was all ribs, which are good points because you can kind of get in and get under. But if you're like, obviously if you're taller and you can get straight down into someone's face consistently, like you're going to do really well. But like if you hit the mat, then you're kind of done. And usually it's the kind of dramatic, you're brought into the center of the ring and someone kind of pulls your hand up, and that's the kind of moment that it's communicated that you've won. But and some people just call it, like you could be sparring and your coach will kind of bring you into the corner and it's kind of like, I'm going to throw in the towel for you. I've only ever seen that kind of happen once, and that's like peak shame.
Yeah,
because someone else has decided, and it's sometimes not even really communicated, like the coach will just kind of like feck it into the ring kind of, and it's always such kind of an uncomfortable moment, and there kind of isn't the hand thrown up really in that scenario, because it's like someone's given up, like it isn't a win as such, though it's like technically it's a win, but it's not the same. Yeah.
There's a question for you, which I'll read it out, John. But I think it's just an interesting question in general, like question for Matt. Is your poetry practice influenced by your boxing or vice versa? But I think that's just interesting in terms of like poetics and like doing physical actual stuff.
I think some of it, like some of it provides kind of like themes, just to kind of write about. But I think other aspects of it then, poetry and writing more generally is a way to kind of work through what's actually happening, because they're like more of the kind of ideas of sport, and particularly combat sports being nonverbal, is even a large part of when I had started training and I was pre-transition, my voice was a very big giveaway, so I would avoid speaking as much as possible. So then I half the time, I enjoy a good chat, so like I spend most of my day talking, and then all of a sudden I would go into a space for about 3 hours and I wouldn't really speak other than kind of grunting and nodding, and then I'd come out and I'd have all of this kind of stuff playing in my head about like, oh, I got hit and I feel okay about that, and that was this kind of reminded me of this thing. So it was a way to kind of debrief with myself afterwards, and kind of in the process of doing that, poetry was one kind of outcome of it. But there was another sense of, I was really thinking about the men who weren't doing that, and I was conscious that like we weren't talking. It wasn't if I wasn't talking, like most of us weren't talking, and part of me was kind of like, well, I don't know how they're debriefing, like, because I feel like that is maybe something that needs to happen a little bit more with sport, consensual violence. Like there needs to kind of be a like, why are you doing this? Like, why are you opting to be punched in the face? Like, what has driven you to this point? And sometimes it's just like sheer enjoyment, pleasure. You enjoy the sport, but I think for a lot of people there might be a little bit more to it, which is worth the unpacking, I think.
It's that something in that was something that I've been thinking about a lot in terms of like staging these kind of violent choreographies in front of people that I've been doing, especially like when, for all intents and purposes, I was paying someone to, this is like a weird exchange in itself, but like paying a man to choke me in front of an audience of people. So what am I trying to say? It sounded so succinct in my head. There's something about how much is too much, or the dialogue that happens around it, like, because like so many thoughts going through my head, like, oh my gosh, is this too much? Like, what are people's reactions going to be with it? Like, is it okay to like present this violence? But then as well, I think because maybe that's the kind of person I am, and I'm doing it in like more of an art context, and having so many conversations about like consent and touch and where is it good to touch and stuff. And I think in terms of like something I've noticed in terms of wrestling, that there are kind of conversations around that. It's done in a very, like, I think you learn like one thing, you learn like the thing that is okay to do in wrestling, and then you do it out. So that you kind of see them like talk to each other, like, oh, I'm going to do this move next on you, or they do it in kind of a very non-verbal way, or like what is it, like that at the start of a match means let's lock up now, let's do this now. This is a great story. Phil was telling me about this. I hope Phil doesn't mind me telling me all these stories. He was telling me like one of his really early matches, he was like fighting against this like much older wrestler, and so when the match starts, you go like that, and that means, right, I'm in charge. We're going to lock up now because I'm dictating the way the match is going to work. And Phil didn't know that that's what that meant. So when this dude did that to him, he did the same thing, and they just kept doing it to each other. And eventually this guy just like lapped him in the face, because he was like so annoyed that like he thought Phil was just being cheeky, but it was like he just didn't know the rules of how this space worked, right? And I think there's so many rules like that in these kind of spaces, like these unwritten rules of like that in terms of like just passing politics. I think there's something there about like acting this particular way so you can be like, and I'm sure you can speak more to that as well, because my access to these things is like creating free classes for like 10 queer folks to like wrestle together. So we're already coming to that space where we're like sitting down and be like, before we get into this, we're gonna have a conversation about like touch and making sure everyone's all right with stuff, or at least trying to like embed that into it as well. Violence, right?
We have another one that's, how do your geographic locations create different contexts which impact your practices?
I'm sure you've got loads of interesting things to talk about, and I have loads of interesting things to talk about, just like in terms of history of like ourselves, right? You go first, because I think I'm interested to hear about the island context.
Yeah, I suppose I'm trying to think about maybe particularly what I would even call my practice. From like I think like if I'm thinking about maybe research and I'm thinking about kind of trans studies, there's like I think a very particular contribution that Ireland can make to these conversations when we're talking about trans people. Part of it because of it being kind of a contested post-colonial nation that is still quite, definitely grappling with the after effects of that, and then kind of almost like a second colonization in terms of the Catholic Church. There's a lot of religious hangover, and those two things, I suppose, have really implicit links to the way that Irish people and people who are living in Ireland are forced to maybe reckon with gender and kind of the gender binary. And I don't think I think there's a lot of really interesting ideas and research and work being done in loads of different areas about where Ireland is at in that. And I suppose my particular contribution is thinking about where does a trans studies that's happening in Ireland contribute to that conversation. I'm not particularly interested in the idea of an Irish trans studies because I'm weary of nationalistic connotations, and I don't really want to reify or remake the wheel by just shoving Ireland in front of something or Irish in front of something and pretending that I'm doing something unique, because I actually think that if Ireland, and particularly white Irish scholars, maybe just took a step back and looked to, Black scholars, post-colonial scholars, they would see that this has been done. This has been like dug up. People have seen to greater extents the violence that colonial countries have kind of carried out on nations, and we could really succinctly trace back what the effect that has had on how we understand gender, sex, sexuality, race, like ethnicity in an Irish context. But I think there's something, and I suppose maybe some of the barrier to that is being a white person. I'm seeing that there's a barrier from a research point of view that people, aren't getting through yet. So I think geography makes an impact. Definitely in the context of my work in that sense. Ro.
I'm not going to say what yours is way better than me. No, yeah, I mean, I guess geographically my context is I'm from Yorkshire, which is where I am now, right? I think a lot about growing up in a rural area and being a queer person and coming to terms with that being a trans person who went to a gender segregated school. So I think that has informed a lot of the unlearning that I've been doing, which is a lifelong journey, full-time job. Yeah, and just, I guess I've been thinking a lot about isolation and that the isolation that lots of people are feeling now. I felt for a very long time. So like for me, like the way it's impacted my practice is like I'm searching for community, or I'm searching for people who feel likewise, or people who don't feel likewise but want to talk about it anyway in like a generative way, right? Yeah. And because going to like a really I definitely talked to you about this the other day, and I remembered it today when I was cleaning the bath, because like I just think about it so often. And it's great being at the telly as well, because they have a very similar like room. Like I went to a school where when they sat us down, like at the start, when I was like a year 7, they sat us down and like, I bet you none of you know what you want to be when you grow up, but we're going to make you into the men that you're going to be. You're going to be doctors and lawyers and blah, 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 blah. And I stuck my hand up and said, no, sorry, I'm going to be an artist. And I don't think I really understood what that was meant at the time, but I just knew that there was something about this old man telling me what I was going to do with my life that I really wasn't in for. Yeah, and he used to have all these old stuffy painting. Like, I'm from a colonizer nation, like, and I'm so resistant to like so much of this, like, I benefit so much from it, but I'm so resistant to all of it. Like, I hate it. Like, and as a person who doesn't I don't know what I'm trying to say, and I feel like what I'm saying is really messy, but like I just being in a room at the Tetley with like those are all paintings of old white men who used to be like people from the Tetley, and being at school and being all these old stuffy paintings of these men like telling us what to do, telling us how to behave, telling us the rules, setting the rules that impact us and everyone. That's the context of my work, is I'm trying to unlearn that. And I'm trying to receive things which are not that, and I'm trying to create things that can be received in ways which aren't that. Yeah. We're at an hour, and I've only paid you for the hour, Matt, so we should.
We have one more question, actually.
Okay, let's do it.
From a disability context, and thinking about which bodies are acceptable or welcome in spaces, as well as those which may seem shameful or spectacle, or are worse sites of violence. How does that tie? How does that tie into gender and sport and violence?
I'm just going to read that question for myself again, just because it's long and I want to make sure I understand it. Cool. Yeah. So I think it's, yeah, obviously a lot of sport gyms, sport practices are very inaccessible to people with disabilities. When I was creating wrestling sessions at the Tetley, I was trying as best as I can to make them accessible, not just for disability, but also trying to make money available and resources and material things, so that if there was any access needs, like I'd love to continue running wrestling sessions with Hannah when we're able to do it again and meet any access need anyone has. So if there's a wheelchair user who wants to learn to wrestle, then like, cool, let's figure out what that is. But yeah, I mean, Matt, what do you have? Do you have anything to?
This question has just made me think of the first kind of conversation that we had, where we kind of finished on a note in terms of like abolition in relation to sport and access.
Yeah.
And you kind of had that really brilliant point around, like, related to other pieces of work that you had, that maybe there's something to be said around access and sport and kind of more of an abolitionist movement towards that, and being, and I definitely think can apply to like a trans context, but also kind of a disability context as well. And like, why are we trying to access potentially harmful spaces that maybe don't recognize the specificity of our needs, be that a trans context or a disability context, or kind of that of other marginalized communities? And maybe we should sometimes be saying no to those spaces that they actually maybe don't get, you know, the privilege really of what we bring as individuals, and that we should kind of be taking that elsewhere and maybe creating new ideas around sports, around bodies, around what even is access, what is ability. Because I think that's because sport, in as much as it's obsessed with the idea of the gender binary being kind of male and female, it's also obsessed with the idea of, you know, right, physically able bodies. So I think that, like, you know, whoever has made this you know, really succinct question is right, that there's definitely a conversation that needs to be happening, and probably is happening, around the connections between transness and disability in finding our way into more meaningful avenues of sport and participation.
Yeah. Well, I think that thank you for bringing up abolition, because I'm always happy to talk about it. But like in a broadest context, thinking about that as like a vast, like just a change of every system, like let's change it. And I think in like this very specific, like access to like sports, like there's always this like let's put our best person forward, let's put like the strongest or the most able forward, within like a very kind of tight, restrictive kind of view of what being able is. Yeah, because it's always about like winning. It's always about our team being better than yours. So and I think there's a way of doing it where it isn't that. Because like when I was running the wrestling sessions, and again, I think this is why like wrestling, I was thinking might be like an easy way into some of these things, is because like it doesn't matter who wins, because the win is a story that we're telling. Other than the fact that a lot of the time wrestling like reiterates like white supremacist and like ability led like thought, but I think there's a way of doing it where you're not doing that, like where you just like doing it for the fun of it, on doing it to like be like reciprocate with someone, like to learn something about each other. And I think going back to our point about like being in an encounter with men in these spaces, like I learned so much about myself and so much about like Phil by like doing a performance where we were like very slowly engaging and navigating each other's bodies through something somewhat adjacent to a wrestling practice. And I think like lack of access for trans folk or for people of ability, differing ability levels, like lack of access to sporting means that you don't have the chance to engage with that sort of kinesthetic learning, right? I've literally just remembered my mum, who I suppose is probably watching this, used to work in a special needs school in Bradford, like when I was very young. And I used to go swimming with children who had cerebral palsy and stuff. So I remember from like a very young age, like, just seeing like the benefits of like the difficulty to meet access needs, but the benefit of meeting them to people. And I just like, I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. We've been told that we have to wrap up, Matt. We have gone 5 minutes over. I just wanted to thank you once again for joining us in this. Thank you, Georgia. Hi. Are we still live? Yeah, we are.
Yeah, we're still live. Yeah. No rush to like wrap up at all.
Well,
really.
Yeah, let's wrap it. Let's turn it down. I just wanted to thank you once again, Matt. I'm just always amazed at you and your ability to succinctly sum up the things that I do not have the language to say. So thank you for.
Well, I want to say thank you so much for creating work that somehow puts the absolute like ruminations of my brain into such, absolutely gorgeous work. Like, I mean, anyone watching who hasn't had a chance to check out Rose's show, go look at it. It's absolutely gorgeous. I spent half my workday going through it, and it was hours well spent. Absolutely fantastic, and thank you so much for giving me, just a small space to have a dialogue with you. I really, really enjoyed it. Thank you. Gorgeous.
Okay. I'm not going to say anything now because I don't know if you've seen I've gone really red. Thank you. Thank you for everyone who came and asked questions, and I hope we were able to be somewhat informative or fun. And also thank you so much, Georgia, for like doing everything behind the scenes. It's really, really appreciated.
No, not at all. Honestly, thank you so much for your conversation and both of your, your generous sharing of both of your practices, creative and sport, which I think, as Karen Barad would say, do really interact with one another. And
don't you? I forgot this. Yeah.
It's just been such a pleasure to work with you, Ro, not only surrounding your practice, but also your work contributing to the TAP program and also developing our working practices at Tatley, for which we are very grateful. And also thank you, Matt, so much for joining us. Hopefully we're able to give you a really warm Yorkshire welcome at the Tatley in the near future.
Yeah, when this whole thing's over, you'll have to come over and show me our box.
Yeah, absolutely, and you can wrestle me.
And we will welcome you at the Tatley for this match. I'm sure it will be very fun. Okay. Thanks everyone for joining us this evening. So if you can, please consider filling in a survey for us with the link in the description. It's really useful for us to hear your feedback and act on it. We hope to see you back at the Tatley very soon, whether for a pint of Tatley's on our terrace or to visit the galleries. Really looking forward to seeing you soon. Thank you so much again, Ro and Matt, for a brilliant in conversation. And see you soon. Bye.